Welcome back, warriors. Kwe, Tansei, Sego, Anibuju. My name is Pam Palmater, and this is my YouTube channel where I focus on educating the resistance and inspiring the next generation of warriors to help us protect the people and the planet. And today is the very first video of my new series called the Reconciliation Book Club. So make sure you stay till the very end because I have a surprise for you all. Thank you all so much for joining me today. This is literally the very first session of my new Reconciliation Book Club here on YouTube, and I'm really excited about it. And I have to thank all of you for the positive comments, all the words of encouragement. I was so surprised by the outreach. People contacted me on all social media platforms. There was lots of new subscribers, and everyone seems really excited about this book club, and I am too. What's really exciting is that just since the announcement, a number of people have contacted me and said they've started their own book clubs either in their homes or in local libraries, and I think that's really exciting because to me, the more people we can get engaged in self-education, the further along we will be in this reconciliation process. So thank you so much for joining me. And today, the very first book that we're reviewing is Whose Land Is It Anyway? A Manual for Decolonization. So before we get started, I want to talk to you about this book club and my goals for this book club. And first and foremost, I want to make it a safe and friendly place for everyone. That youth can participate, elders can participate, Indigenous peoples and allies in a safe space where there's no conflict, there's no attacks, there's no promotion of hatred or racism or anything like that. Now, I know my subscribers have been entirely fantastic, so I don't expect any problems. But because I'm the one responsible for this book club, I just have to let you know that if there's swearing or attacking other people or any kind of hatred, all of those comments will be deleted and those accounts will be blocked because we really want this to be a family-friendly place. So let's get started. Here is the first book. It's called Whose Land Is It Anyway? A Manual for Decolonization. It's been edited by Peter McFarlane and Nicole Chavez, and it was published by the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators in BC. Thank you so much for putting this book together and for all of the hard work you did to make sure that you had some of the leading Indigenous activists and scholars and thought leaders in this country contribute to this book. Now, many of you may have already noticed, but the cover art here looks very familiar, and that's because it's done by the Métis artist Christy Belcourt, and all of her work is so inspiring. It's a real symbol of our resistance and the power of art to move people, and I think it was a very appropriate choice for this book. Now, in terms of the technical part of this, it's a very small book. Like I mentioned in my last video, it's available completely online as a PDF or an ebook. You can totally download it. They didn't print out hard copies to sell anywhere, so you can't buy it online, but you can find it for free online. And though it's a very short book, it's only 72 pages of text in total. There's 14 really small chapters, and it's divided into 3 core themes. And I think these themes make a lot of sense. It goes from, what they're describing as the machinery of colonialism, and then they move into acts of resistance, and then it ends with, some conversation around what is reconciliation and what is the path forward. So I think in terms of how the book is structured, it's really structured chronologically, it makes sense logically, and for anyone who is just new to Indigenous issues at all, I think it would really help, understand where the authors are coming from. Now, the really exciting thing about this book for me is that it features 14 different authors, and these authors are from all over Canada. They're both Indigenous authors and some allies, and some of the most well-known Indigenous activists and thought leaders in this country. So you have authors like Russ Diabo, who's a Mohawk policy analyst and activist, Taigi Alfred, who's also another Mohawk, and he's a scholar and activist, Bev Jacobs, another Mohawk. There seems to be a Mohawk theme here, but trust me, there are other Indigenous groups represented here. You have Kanahos Manuel, who is the daughter of the late Arthur Manuel, for whom this book is done in memory. And she's from the Secwepemc in BC. I contribute a chapter. In fact, that's one of the surprises. I do the last chapter talking about reconciliation, and I'm from the Mi'kmaq Nation. So there's people, men and women and younger folks and older folks, all represented here. And one of the allies who actually helped bring this book together is actually Nicole Shabbos, who was the late Arthur Manuel's life partner and traveled with him all over the world in international forums to help advocate for Indigenous peoples. And her chapter is pretty special. She really reminds us about some of the core messages from the late Arthur Manuel. And Arthur Manuel himself used to be the chief of the Niskonlithban in BC. He was a well-known Indigenous activist all over Canada, but he was known all over the US and internationally because he constantly protected our sovereignty and our rights, not just here on Turtle Island, but at the international level, to make sure that we were engaging as sovereigns at that level. So I think it's really, really special that we're focusing on this book that was done in his honor. The other thing I really like about how this book is structured is that it's not an academic book. So you don't have tons and tons of citations and research, demographics, statistics, and all of that stuff. People in this book are not writing this for an academic audience. They're not trying to convince a courtroom of what their beliefs are. This really reflects true, authentic Indigenous voices and the voices of allies, basically saying, you know, the hard truth. Here's where we are. Here's how we got here, but here's the situation that we're in and what we need to do if we're going to, you know, have a future where we're safe in our identities, where we can enjoy our lands, where we're free from violence. And I think that's a real strength here, that it's about Indigenous voice and it's not done in a way where they have to prove themselves in any way. And I think learning from Indigenous peoples in this way, in some ways, almost like storytelling, it's really powerful. And I think for people who are reading this book for the first time or who haven't been introduced to Indigenous issues, I think it's a really effective way to reach out and make a call for people to become allies and make a change. Now, the other strength about this is that this is a book about hard truth. There is no one in this book that is sugarcoating anything. You won't hear any political speeches, you won't hear any government jargon, and you certainly won't find any of the authors minimizing what has happened or continues to happen to us. And that's a real strength, because if we're going to engage in this, you know, community of self-education and really talk about what reconciliation looks like, we have to get at the hard truth. Truth has to come before justice, and justice has to come before reconciliation. And I think we're just at the truth and fact-finding part of this journey, and that's why this book is so important, because it's just the straight truth, straight from Indigenous voices and allies. Now, the fact that this book is about hard truth might be a little bit jarring to some people, but I think if you read it a few times, you will see that this whole book is full of messages of hope. And in fact, when I read it, I got reinvigorated and even more inspired to work harder on this project of reconciliation. Now, I'd like to know how you felt about that. So make sure you leave me your comments and your impressions in the comment box below this video so that I know where everybody is on this journey. Overall, did you feel inspired by this book too, despite the difficult messages, or did you find it a little too difficult to absorb? Now, this book, like its title, is set up as a manual for decolonization. The focus here is the impact of colonization and what we need to do to continue the path of decolonization. And if you read carefully, you'll notice that each chapter contains some really important message or call to action that you could put together as your own manual to decide where you need to go from here in terms of reconciliation. Now, what I would like to do is share some particularly powerful passages from just a few of the authors. I don't want to cover them all and spoil the surprise for those of you who haven't read the manual yet, or for those of you who want to reread it and think about these issues some more. But I really want to start with Tagi Alfred. So Tagi Alfred is a Mohawk scholar and activist and, prolific author. He's written and published lots. He has his own books, some of which we'll probably cover in this book club. And he has some really important messages. First of all, he talks about how the core harm of colonization has been the severing of our living relationship between ourselves, our nations, and the land. And he's also very honest when he says that the struggle is far from over. And to his mind, the solution moving forward is the same solution that's been there since our ancestors, and that is maintaining and revitalizing that connection we have with the land and getting our land back. There's simply no way around that. Land is core to decolonization. And this is a very similar message that Arthur Manuel gave in his chapter when he talks about the core harm done during colonization was the massive land dispossession from Indigenous peoples. Arthur explains that this massive land theft, going from 100% of Turtle Island being Indigenous territory to less than 0.2% of our lands held in tiny reserves, is a massive land dispossession which has caused incredible harm. Arthur explains that this massive land theft is what directly related to both our extreme poverty and our dependence on the colonizing governments. And he agrees with Ty. He says the solution is getting our land back and our governing power over our lands and implementing our right to govern these territories and make decisions over what does and doesn't happen to the lands and waters, resources, and peoples in our territory. Now, Russ Diabo's chapter takes a little bit of a different turn. He focuses on how the colonial governments used the Indian Act to control First Nations people. So deciding who was and who wasn't an Indian, who could live on reserve, keeping them trapped on reserves, that was a form of control that in many ways still continues today. He also highlights the fact that the Indian Act is just part of the larger government policy towards us, and that has always been to quote unquote get rid of the Indian problem. And Russ's really hard message is that Canada's goals have never changed. They are still using the Indian Act and other policies to try to assimilate us, get us out of the way so that Canada can continue with settlement and extraction of our resources and wealth generation while many of our people die in poverty. This is where Kanahou's Manual's chapter comes into play, because she talks about land defense and defense of her territories and her peoples on the ground, actually defending territory from extraction, from contamination, from pollution, from invasion by Canada's military or police forces, and she talks about real life personal experience in this regard. Now keep in mind, Kanahous is the daughter of the late Arthur Manuel, so it should be no surprise that she is a warrior on the ground defending our rights. Canahus doesn't sugarcoat the truth either. She is saying flat out that this is the battle that we are in. It's a very real battle. It's a physical battle. It's not a metaphorical one. And it's one where she calls on everybody to fall in line and protect our territories for future generations, both Indigenous peoples and allies. And it's the violence of land extraction that Beverly Jacobs talks about. Now, she's also a Mohawk scholar and activist, and she talks about this core relationship between the colonization of Indigenous lands and the colonization and targeting of Indigenous women and girls. She talks about the history of the Indian Act, removing Indigenous women and children from their own communities, the very early days of murdered and disappeared Indigenous women, to how the violence continues today into the present with literally thousands of murdered and disappeared Indigenous women and girls. Beverly makes the case that this is the heart of colonization, extractive violence in every sense, both from the lands and Indigenous women and girls, and it has wreaked havoc on all of our nations. And she makes a very powerful call for us to take back our power. And I would suggest going back, rereading her chapter, and really thinking about the call that she's making, both on an individual level and a collective level. So one of the surprises is that I did the last chapter of the book, and I focus on decolonizing as a way of taking back our power. And I consider this whole book to be very inspiring, and I wanted to leave people with the message that we have the power to do this. And how do I know that? Because our people are still here. We have survived every kind of genocide that colonial governments have thrown at us. And our ancestors and those who are living today have fought, they have been strong, they have been resilient, they have been determined and proud of who we are as Indigenous peoples. You know, we believe in the sovereignty of our nations. We believe in the beauty of our cultures and traditions and languages and practices. And I know we have the power to make this change. Every little bit of success that we've had, every single right that we've ever proven, every single power that we've exercised hasn't come without a fight. And that's an unfair burden for us. However, we've done it and we will continue to do it. And the authors in this book show us that it's already well underway. And what I want allies to get from this is that they have a role in this. You know, once you know better, you should do better. And I know that it's unfair that, you know, this should fall on our allies and should fall on Indigenous peoples. You know, in fairness, government should be righting the wrongs. But until they step up, we need to be the government and we need to be the ones to force them to do this. So when I do book reviews, I always have to have some kind of critique. I like to look at the strengths of a book, but also see where there might have been some room for improvement. And honestly, although I might be a tiny bit biased because I'm a contributing author, I have to say in all objective honesty, the only thing that I could find in this book that I really wanted to be different was that instead of 14 chapters, I wanted 400 chapters. Because this is exactly the kind of material that we need to share with one another. I mean, really lifting up the voices of Indigenous activists about where we are and where we need to head. I think those are important messages for everyone, Indigenous peoples and allies alike. And so it's kind of a frustrating critique in that it's the strength that it is so small because it's accessible and easily readable by most people, and also that I wish it was, you know, many thousands and thousands of pages longer. But overall, I mean, I give this book a really high rating. I think we need more open access books. I think we need more smaller books like this, more books that focus on voice versus just having all the research and data and statistics and demographics, because there's lots of time and place for that, but we really need to lift up Indigenous voices and the voices of our allies in a more constructive way and an easily accessible way, and I think this book does it. So let me know in the comments below if you agree with me that this kind of book was easily accessible, it was easy reading for you, and what kind of books you would like to see in the future. Already people are giving me suggestions on what kind of books they'd like me to review, and I'm making a list of them, and I'll try to get to all of them as soon as I can, but let me know in the comments below what you think. So let's move on to some of the comments and impressions that were shared by the people who subscribe to this Reconciliation Book Club. And first of all, let me just say, wow. I mean, the response was just amazing. It was far more than I expected, and that in and of itself gives me hope about reconciliation and where we're headed for the future. So I'm going to review some of the comments and impressions that were left. So for example, Katie says that she thinks that the book was really well done. Joe says it's in fact one of the best books that he ever read. Arle says that they learned a lot from the book, and that was the whole idea of sharing this book. Now, Drew and Susan, two separate subscribers, both really liked Russ Diabo's chapter on the Indian Act because it explained the extent of government control over Indigenous peoples, and that was something that they were learning for the first time. So I'm really glad you both got something out of Russ's chapter. Now, Goldfish River said that all of the articles were very well written, but that they thought that the chapters written by Sharon Venn, Nicole Shabbos, Senator Sinclair, and myself were especially enlightening with really good messages. Now, Cubert had a very different response to the book. They felt a bit depressed after reading it. Cubert felt that the no-holds-barred truth was a bit overwhelming and too much to handle all in one sitting. And I want to thank you, Cubert, for sharing your honest reaction to this book, because I think it's important. For all of those who have left comments or questions, there are probably hundreds more who didn't feel comfortable to do so. And by you sharing your honest reaction, other readers out there will know that they're not the only ones having this reaction. Now, it's true, we are all at very different stages of decolonization. Some of us are just beginning, some of us are well on our way. All of us are learning about how to decolonize in a situation where colonization is ongoing and continues. It's not like one bad thing happened in the past and we just need to move on. The fact of the matter is that colonization continues, the violence continues, the injustice continues, and so trying to deal with that is going to be difficult for all of us. Just the truth of it, the hard, unsugar-coated truth of it is very difficult. And I want you all to know that I am purposely starting with the most difficult stuff. And I'm doing that because, to my mind, this whole reconciliation project has gotten started off on the totally wrong foot. Governments and lots of people want to jump to all the good stuff, to the changes of names on building and celebrating National Indigenous Peoples Day and sharing in cultural festivities, and that is all very premature. We're nowhere near any of that yet. What we should be doing is working very hard on uncovering all of the truth and dealing with the truth, and then bringing about some kind of social justice, actually dealing with the crisis at hand, not trying to historicize it or make tearful apologies and move forward. We actually need to end the injustice. And so that's why I'm starting all of us right in the middle of it, because we've been historicized so much, and what we've learned in school is often in history books or sociology books that start in history. We're not dealing with who are Indigenous peoples right now? Where are they? What's the context? How do we get here? And where do we need to go from here? And because most Canadians are going to get the majority of their education from the media or what they see on TV, it's important to know what's happening right now and what Indigenous peoples are saying about it so that you can understand that. If we only talk about pre-contact practices or hunting and fishing in, 500 years ago, that isn't going to bring us to where we are today. We have to understand colonization in the current form, and that's why I'm starting out with the hard stuff. My goal is that once we've done a sufficient amount of self-education, we can actually move towards some of the good stuff, sharing of the culture and the language and the practices and all of those really fulfilling, enriching things. But reconciliation is about doing all of the hard work first. And that's why I started with the hard stuff. So Cubert, I hope you stay with the book club, and I hope everyone out there who shares Cubert's feelings of depression after reading some of these difficult issues, that you stick with the book club, keep learning, keep putting in the hard and difficult work if you're able to, so that eventually we can get to some of the really good stuff, some of the stuff that we need to celebrate. Now, let's move on to some of the questions that people sent me. So Susan has a question, and she asks, how are activists viewed within their communities when they challenge the status quo? And that is literally the question of the century, because it is so important to understand that because colonization has devastated our relationships within our families, our communities, our nations, our districts, our houses, and our clans. It's devastated relationships between Indigenous peoples and settlers and the Crown or government as a whole, that there's clearly going to be some conflict when it comes to challenging the status quo and unsettling all of this colonization, essentially the whole task of decolonization. So it's an excellent question because obviously there's tension, but there's no one answer. Keep in mind that on Turtle Island, at least the northern part in what is now called Canada, there's between 50 to 60 or 70 traditional Indigenous nations that have now been divided up into 634 individual First Nations. So you're talking about lots of nations, lots of communities all across this territory who are at different stages, have had different experiences, and reacted very differently. So in some communities, for example, there is a lot of tension. So if people speak out or they challenge the status quo, they'll be retaliated against, they'll be vilified, they'll be looked at as troublemakers, they might even be ousted from their communities or prevented from participating in, say, community meetings, for example. But then there's other communities across the country who see these people challenging the status quo as actually, knowledge keepers themselves, as strategists, as people trying to fight to protect their nation. And they're welcome in as strategizers, as advisors, as people who can help the government move forward in that community to resist what's going on in this country and protect, defend, and assert their land rights. And there's no better example of that than many of the people who started and maintained the Idle No More movement. So all across the country, there was a whole bunch of different reactions to people involved in Idle No More. There was primarily grassroots people saying the status quo is literally killing our people. We need to make a change, trying to educate everyone. In some of their communities, they were welcomed as advisors, and today still work with First Nations as advisors about how to, advance our rights. And in other communities, they were ousted and they were labeled troublemakers. And I think part of the problem is how the government reacts to Indigenous activists, Indigenous scholars, Indigenous people who are advocating to protect our just core basic human rights, Native rights. And they often label us as some kind of terrorists or militants or troublemakers or quote unquote bad Indians. And this has really caused division within our own communities. So the government leads by example, and the old divide and conquer way of treating First Nations has been very, very effective. But where I gain hope from all of these people, all of these activists and educators and advocates, really trying to educate the Canadian public and their own people and really make change and challenge the status quo, is that after Idle No More, especially after Idle No More, we had developed this huge nationwide, Turtle Island-wide network of people where we can connect, we can support one another so that no one has to feel alone in this project. So even though there might be some tensions in other places, that's par for the course. Any social change throughout history in any nation or society has always come with some degree of conflict and tension. So we just need to support each other to work through that to get to the other side. And that other side is decolonization and the restoration of our self-determination. So thank you very much for that question, Susan. I think it was an important one, and it really shows a degree of caring for the people who are undertaking this activist work right now. Now, Lindsay has a question, and she says, I read the book and I keep asking how. The government of Canada is not interested in reconciliation, with no real leaders in the country and only politicians. How are those who are interested in healing the colonial past and making things right with Indigenous peoples and the land supposed to make a difference? And that is another amazing question, and it's one that I get all the time, and I think it's one of the most important questions. It seems very overwhelming because it is. We're not talking about tinkering around the edges. We're not talking about little tiny legal amendments and tiny changes to policies. We're talking about grave human rights violations. We're talking about genocide. We're talking about land theft and destruction. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about multiple overlapping crises that should be treated in a very urgent and comprehensive way, and it's not. So we have a whole bunch of allies saying, well, what do we do about it when we don't see any politicians doing what needs to be done? And I agree with you. There are precious few politicians that I have ever seen and no parties that have ever come up with a comprehensive plan for ending genocide in Canada and rectifying in real and substantive ways all of the land and resource theft and the destruction to the environment and the basic human rights violations. All of them have policies to deal with one or two priority areas, but none of them are talking about real, comprehensive, and substantive reconciliation. So the unfair burden falls upon us as Indigenous peoples and allies, unfortunately. But remember that ultimately, the real governing power in any democracy or just government are the people themselves. Just look at Indigenous nations. The governing body is the people. All they do is appoint or elect or choose through ceremony or tradition or cultural practice their leaders, but they're the spokespeople. They're supposed to carry out the will of the people. And everything has become topsy-turvy when you talk about Canada or the United States. So-called democracies are ruled by precious few powerful people who've long forgotten about the voices of the people. They assume that because they were voted into office or their party was supported through an election, that gives them free rein to do whatever they want, regardless what the people are saying. So we need our allies to act as the governing force together with the Indigenous governing force and make the changes that are required. So you might think that this is all very overwhelming, and if you try to deal with all of it at once, of course it'll be overwhelming and discouraging, and you won't see the value of the actions that you take. But start small. That's what I suggest to people. You can't do everything all at once. Even us as Indigenous activists, most of us have very specific focus areas. So why don't you start with going on the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society. Dr. Cindy Blackstock and her organization has a list of things that you can do that are free. Things like signing petitions and writing letters and, helping to educate and advocate on behalf of First Nations kids in foster care to push Canada to end the racial discrimination against those kids. There's so many things you can do. Perhaps you're connected with municipalities or business leaders or wealthy landowners where you can all work together as a collective to identify lands that could be transferred back to individual or local First Nations communities. That would be a tremendous idea, and that's already happening. There's so many different things. So while you're on this, self-education journey, look for ways in which you can contribute in really meaningful ways to advocate for change alongside of Indigenous peoples. So now that we've done the review of the book and reviewed some of the comments and impressions and talked about some of the questions and answers, what I want you to do is go back, look at the book, and look through each of the chapters and find at least one action item. Make a list of what Indigenous peoples and allies are saying needs to be done moving forward, and then really think about that list and where you can fit in to one or a couple of those action items. What it is that you can do to contribute in a really meaningful way to take action to address the issues that were raised in the book. For those of you who are looking for additional resources on top of this book club, you can go to my website, www.pampalmater.com, where you can find a list of my publications, but also a list of resources like national commissions and inquiries so that you can be up to date on what's happening. Also, if you really liked some of the writing in this book by different authors, check out my podcast. It's hosted on SoundCloud, but available everywhere else like iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher, because I have some extended interviews with many of the authors in this book, like Rusta Abo, Ty Alfred, Kanahus Manuel, and more to come, where they talk at length about these issues and the things that need to be done in a really profound way, in a really action-based and hopeful way, and you might learn a lot from the podcast that will complement what you read in the book. I also do blogs on everyday issues. So these would be more current issues that are in the media. And it's called Indigenous Nationhood Blog. And I have tons and tons and tons of blogs there. If you follow me there, you'll always be up to date on what the current issues are. And of course, my YouTube channel. I have it set out into playlists. You can look at previous lectures, you can look at media, and you can also look at my YouTube videos where I talk about really difficult legal and political issues. I try to break down some court cases so that they're easier to understand. The National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, I try to summarize their report. There's lots of resources online that you can access to learn more and complement what you're doing in this book club. So the next book review in our Reconciliation Book Club is going to be An Act of Genocide, Colonialism and the Sterilization of Aboriginal Women. It was written by Karen Stote and it's published by Fernwood Publishers. It's an excellent book. I think it follows strongly after the book that we just read. It's also very timely after the National Inquiry's final report on murdered and missing Indigenous women, which talked about Canada being guilty of genocide and talking about the forced forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous women and girls. So I think this book is very timely, very important to read. What I'll do is I'll leave a link to this book in the description box below, so you can purchase it online, or you can go into a store and buy it, borrow it from a library, share it with a friend. Perhaps you're starting your own reconciliation library like mine. I have 1 million books from Native authors and on Native issues. It's totally up to you, whatever way you want to engage in this reconciliation book club. Now, the final review of this book will be on Saturday, August 31st. So you have a little bit more than a month to read the book and leave me your questions and comments and impressions, and don't forget to leave them all in the comment section below this video so that I can include them in my next video on this book. And finally, to the surprise, the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators of BC have given me 10 hard copies of this book, Whose Land Is It Anyway?, to give to 10 lucky subscribers to my Reconciliation Book Club. And I just pick them at random, and what'll happen is I'll read your name here, I'll post it in the description box below. If you see your name, contact me on my website through my contact form or at pampalmater@hotmail.com and give me the address of, give me your address so I can mail you a hard copy, or the address of someone who you think would really enjoy having a hard copy of the book, and I'll send it to them. So here are the 10 winners of a hard copy of Whose Land Is It Anyway? Cluster Together, Drew Indy 2, Leroy Hughes, Goldfish River, Michelle Poirier Brown, Lindsay Moyes, Joe Ho, Patricia Staples, Monica Martins, and Heather Harkins. Congratulations. Thank you so much for engaging and participating, and my hope is that future publishers will do the same thing so that we have books to give away as prizes to people who are participating in this really important self-education project in my Reconciliation Book Club. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you again in the month with the next book.